Hello and welcome to the History of Ceramics.
I'm Stephanie Rosine.
And I'm Paul Greenhouse.
In this episode, we're traveling to France to meet the father of French Art Nouveau and the sweeping organic forms that came to define one of the most exciting eras in European culture.
Indeed it was. But this time we're not talking about pots or figures. We're talking about the third component of the ceramic universe, tile. And not just tile in a kind of flat sense that we normally think of it, but tile as part of architecture, an element which is integrated in, sculptural and much more wide-ranging. So it's tile with a big T, I think, isn't it? And we're going to do it by going largely through Paris and venturing out into other areas of France at various points. We're going to roam the streets and look at these wonderful buildings, and we're going to go underground into the Paris metro to explore how tile changed the lives of the average Parisian traveller. We'll be looking at the life and work of Hector Guimard.
Many people might recognize Guimard for his very famous Paris metro stations, right? But we know that he was really important in a lot of different ways. And I'm really excited to chat with you today because you're the expert. You've just written this massive book on Art Nouveau architecture. And so I'd love to kind of dig into that knowledge today. Can you tell me why was he so important? What are some of his great achievements?
Well, I think he's there at a particular moment, I think, and there's no doubt he was a massive influence on the Art Nouveau style, but much more widely, I would say, on architectural practice.
And
late 19th, early 20th century,
Great.
a very major figure, not just for his buildings, but for his ideas, I would say.
And I love that you described him to me as an artist architect.
Yeah, that's how he described himself. And we might discover further in, he wasn't the shyest person, I would say. Let's say he was an extremely confident Frenchman. He called himself artiste architecte. He would sign buildings with that.
Interesting.
So he considered himself an artist integrating into architecture, which I think is incredibly interesting.
I think it is too.
Yeah.
So he also used tile quite a bit in his work, and he's exploring tile in a variety of ways. Where does that kind of slot into the narrative around the story of the history of ceramics?
Tile is incredibly interesting in this period, and we'll discover as we move in, and it will come up again and again, I think, over the weeks, that tile is in a golden age, I think. And it's episodic, the history of tile, I would say. It seems to come and dominate architecture for a period and then fade backwards.
And we're not talking just about sort of tiles that you would line your kitchen or your bathroom with. We're talking about architectural tiles, so essentially almost bricks in a way, building materials.
Absolutely,
that are made out of clay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're talking about a grand integration of, tile, brick, but sculptural activity as well. Mainly cast and applied to buildings, but it's a sculptural activity as much as anything of integrating ceramic art into buildings. And yes, this is a golden moment. There's no doubt about it. And Guimard is one of the major figures for that.
Okay. And so Guimard is born in Lyon in 1867. Tell me more about his beginnings.
A pretty ordinary middle-class childhood and youth, I would say. I think it was clearly recognized that he was pretty precocious very early on, and his parents were quite keen. It was clear also he had an aptitude for the arts, and his parents were keen to encourage that. And he starts his training at the age of 15, and by then he's moved to Paris. So a relatively ordinary middle-class upbringing. There's not a wild artistic surround in his family that we can note. But clearly he's thought to be a gifted young man. At 15, in 1882, he enrolls at the École supérieure des arts décoratifs in Paris, the Decorative Arts College. And I think that's vital. It's vital not just for him. I think it's vital for Art Nouveau because he gets his hands dirty. he gets to see what ceramic is.
Mhm.
He gets to understand what it's capable of doing. Also stained glass, metalwork, furniture. So he has these 3 years, which I can't think of any other architect in that period who comes to great prominence who had that kind of background. So he does that. And then he enrolls in the architecture program at the École Nationale des Arts des Beaux-Arts. So he goes to the Beaux-Arts in Paris. Now, the Beaux-Arts, you could train as a painter there and a sculptor, and architecture at that stage was seen as a mainstream art alongside
Right.
those two. So he goes there and he works as an architect, and then he's out there.
Mm.
I would say he was a pretty hyperactive kid. He must have been very irritating to try and teach, I would think. And he's out and around and looking.
Huh.
He's very clearly at that stage looking for something new. There's a certain aggression in him from what we can see. And he starts to get jobs and he starts to get out there. And he's involved in various minor architectural projects and so forth. So again, he's getting his hands dirty very early
So
on.
how does this this hands-on training, how do you see that manifesting in the maybe the physicality of the type of work that he designs, or is there where do you see that? Because I find that really interesting. Someone who is designing a building, having a deep knowledge of how the elements he's using might have been made.
Yeah.
And I think that certainly from a maker's perspective, I could design something fine, but without an understanding of the material, to me, this harkens right back to sort of the arts and crafts movement. But this understanding of the material itself and how it is impacting the way that he's designing. And do you think that that's a thing that really pushes him towards a new style?
I do. And also, we're at a very interesting moment in the history of architecture. Iron and glass architecture has been growing as a phenomenon for several decades. The very first skyscraper we always date to 1885 in Chicago, by the definition being a steel and glass
Yeah.
building that can go over a certain height with no supporting walls. But prior to that, the conservatory, the glass house, major exhibition buildings and so forth,
Yeah.
iron and glass
Yeah.
was around. But it hadn't really been integrated into architecture as such. It was still kind of seen as engineering.
Interesting.
And I think it's this generation that pull all that
Those
in.
together.
But alongside that, there's a pushback, as you suggest. The arts and crafts movement is founded in 1888. Well, that's
Right in the middle of this, isn't
right
it?
in the middle of this.
Yeah.
It becomes very famous across Europe and it starts in Britain and then it expands around. So we've got this interesting tension between making things and new technology
Yeah.
that allows you to open up architecture. I would say that's what the new architecture is going to be about. So Guimard's in the middle of all that and deeply curious. He starts to travel, fascinatingly, and he must have been very gifted in terms of decorative and ornamental art, because at the Paris World's Fair of 1889, so arguably the greatest World's
Yeah.
Fair so
Yeah.
far held. In fact, each one the French held, you could say, was the
Successively
greatest.
greater.
Each one seems to get great. 1889 is when they build the Eiffel Tower.
Right.
So we have this, iron.
Right.
And
Massive engineering feat.
yeah, a wonderful feat of engineering. And a lot of the big buildings are basically big sheds that things are in. He gets a job helping decorate the Palace of Electricity. And now in 1889, electricity,
That's a big thing.
it's like nuclear power or
Yeah.
even more advanced. It's new. And so he gets involved in this newness. Also, there's this new concept which is around at the time, a German idea, in fact, Gesamtkunstwerk. Gesamtkunstwerk means total work of art. And it comes to us actually from opera, from Richard Wagner. He used the term first, but it gets taken up by the architects in the Art Nouveau style, and Guimard especially loved it. And what they mean by it basically is that all of the arts get pulled in together and integrated into a single approach. So you can imagine with opera, obviously, it's every art being pulled in, but it becomes an idea in architecture as well, the total work of art. Gesamtkunstwerk. And I would say Guimard is the single greatest exponent of that, arguably, apart from perhaps the Spanish. But Guimard is one of the great figures for integrating all of the arts into a single ensemble. He also helped design a little cafe on the edge of the site, the Grand Café Neptune. So he's getting his hands dirty, he's getting involved with other architects, and he's recognizing the new technology. And he's trained as a decorative artist. So that's a really interesting mix, I would say. Yeah. So he's out there. For me, the next thing is that he starts to travel. He goes to London. Now, we don't know exactly when he was in London. It's my view he probably went a few times between 1892 and 1894. And as we go on, we'll see these dates are going to be very important. He meets with the arts and crafts people. It's my view he probably met William Morris. William Morris dies, of course, in 1896. So now, I don't know that, and we've not got a record, but we do know that he gains politics. And William Morris had stopped designing and had become effectively a Marxist at that stage. But many of the arts and crafts practitioners, like Walter Crane and so forth, they were very left-wing. And they were using the crafts to be political. And now that wasn't an element in French decorative art. That was English.
That was English,
Yeah. And it was transmitting around. But more important than any of that, he goes to Brussels.
And what's happening in Brussels?
Brussels is where the Art Nouveau style was invented. It's not French, it's Belgian. Now, quite a lot of French writers have disputed that, but let's just get this clear. Art Nouveau architecture starts in Brussels, and the original Art Nouveau architect is Victor Horta. Another architect, Paul Hancart, is another major figure but dies young. And by 1893, so we think he's travelling around Guimard exactly at this stage. 1893, the very first Art Nouveau building is built.
In Brussels?
In Brussels, the Tassel house. Now, Guimard saw the plans for that and almost certainly saw it, well, we know he saw it, probably while it was still being finished, in fact, very early on. He met Victor Horta, and we don't have a record of what they chatted about, but he met Paul Hancart, and he saw Paul Hancart's house, and it was deeply influential on him, and they became good friends.
I mean, it's arguably one of the greatest Art Nouveau buildings.
It's a wonderful, wonderful building, yeah.
Shall we chat just a little bit about what Art Nouveau means or what it represents visually? Because I think as we're chatting about it, and maybe some of our listeners who are familiar with Guimard would have an understanding, but it's all about the curvilinear whiplash line, isn't it? This sort of moving away from sort of, the engineering of straight lines and corners and 90 degrees. And it's this incorporation of nature and an organic shape. And I mean, I remember being a young art student in my art history classes, seeing the images of these buildings. And I mean, they're incredible.
Well, I think you've defined it for us very nicely. That was brilliantly done. I think that it's to do with this embracing of nature. And it's a very organic approach to nature.
And it's sort of bringing nature from the outside to the inside.
Curvilinear line everywhere, which the new technology of iron and glass allow you to do, of course. But also, it tips over. We start to see it's not just natural form. It feels like body forms as well. It's sensuous.
And it's not just tied to architecture.
No.
It's tied to sort of all of the decorative arts. It comes into printing, Aubrey Beardsley. And so we see figures and sort of flowing hair and things like that. And so it feels like to me that Art Nouveau, certainly has this incredible architecture front, but it is deeply connected to the decorative arts.
Absolutely, it is. And once again, perfect definition, I would say.
And so it makes sense for me to learn and to know about his training. And he seems sort of poised to be at a is it a perfect storm? He has this training, he has these new exciting ideas. He's sort of a tour de force, and he's in the right place at the right time, maybe?
He couldn't have hit a better spot, I would say. So with Art Nouveau, many of us rather sad characters gather together in conferences and fight over
Who
who did the first Art Nouveau. I think we've established that, and I did that. In reality, the very first Art Nouveau imagery, I think, is not architectural. It's graphic design and posters.
Yeah.
And I think by a matter of months only, Aubrey Beardsley, an English designer who was in the circle of Oscar Wilde in 1892, produces a range of prints based on Oscar Wilde's play Salome,
yeah.
which becomes an exhibition and goes to Paris in 1892 and then travels around Europe. So we know, and then a new magazine, the Studio magazine, publishes these in late 1892, 1893. And at that same moment, just literally months on, Victor Horta creates this house that looks like a three-dimensional Aubrey Beardsley.
Yeah.
So did he know those prints? I'm 100% sure he did, but he had to translate that into architecture. So it's a major achievement.
And so we know these sort of things are happening maybe concurrently, you know. How do we come upon the name Art Nouveau? Because that's a French naming.
It's a French name, isn't it? So Art Nouveau, it's a new term. It means the new art. And it's a term that is used by the British, the Americans, and virtually everyone else. The French, Art Nouveau. The first time we can see it used publicly, in fact, is in Paris. So the style is invented as an architectural form in Brussels, as a graphic form in London, and then it starts to move around. And in 1895, a couple of years on, a German art dealer who lived in Paris, Siegfried, who dealt mainly in Japanese things, which is very, very important, mainly in Japanese art, he opens a gallery which he calls the Maison de l'Art Nouveau, the House of the New Art. And Art Nouveau gets its name. And he fills his first exhibition with arts and crafts, William Morris, but also the Belgians, they're all there. The Norwegians, we start to see a Norwegian painting and so forth. So he pulls things in from all over Europe and Germany, and he creates this exhibition. And the style gets a name, Art Nouveau. Now, the other thing to remember, of course, at that stage is that Paris is the absolute center of the entire art world.
Yeah.
So it needed that legitimacy before it could take off. Regardless of what happened in Belgium, it would have remained perhaps a Belgian style.
Right.
Perhaps. But once it's hit Paris, it goes global. Well, international, not quite global, but it went out there. And Paris had somehow appropriated the style, and we tend to think of Paris as being the place. So it's important. What we would say as well with Art Nouveau is that, in my view, it is the first self-conscious modernism. That is to say, these architects and designers were deliberately trying to create a new style, self-consciously so, which they called modern, that suited the age they were in. They had a view that all the previous styles didn't really map on to the world they were in. So Art Nouveau, the new art, it was going to change the shape of how the city looked. So in that sense, they are the first modernists. And in the way they actually practiced, it was progressive. It was self-consciously trying to change things. They wrote manifestos. They were the first ones to do that. So they almost set it out like a political party. It was almost like that. This is what we're doing. This is where we're going. And that was exactly the strategy that later modernists into the 20th century would inherit. And in actual fact, quite a lot of these architects did become later modernists. They were involved in things like the Bauhaus and in the redesigning of the city and so forth. So it is the first modernism in that sense. Now, Guimard is back in Paris, 1894, and he starts to practice seriously as an independent architect. So Paris is alive with Art Nouveau, but at this stage, it's decorative art only and painting.
Guimard's major first work then?
Yeah.
He's dabbled in all of these things. He's traveled. He's been exposed to new styles. This new style, L'Art Nouveau, has been named. And what's next for him? What's the first thing that we sort of remember him classically by? And how's that connected to ceramics?
Right. He gets to build his first major building himself. Everything else before then had been in collaboration, and it was bits and bats, really. It's an apartment block in the 16th arrondissement in Paris, which was new. When you walk around there, the huge bulk of it is post-1870, I would
And it's
say.
because it's expanding out from the center.
It's part of Paris
Paris
growing,
expansion.
as all the major cities were. And the 16th. And interestingly enough, going forward for the next 40 or 50 years, a lot of the greatest modern buildings are there.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the modern architects like Le Corbusier and Mallet Stevens. So 16th remains an interesting play. But the first place to really develop in terms of modern architecture was Guimard. He builds an apartment block called the Castel-Barranger. And major apartments, not super wealthy, but well-heeled. And he throws everything at it that he's learned. It's a highly complicated building. Anything you can think of is stuck to that building in some ways. But there are several things which really jump out. The Art Nouveau line, this swirling, curving line, which he's seen in Brussels.
Right, that whiplash.
The whiplash line, as it became known, absolutely. So from Aubrey, Beardsley, and from the Belgians.
Yeah.
That's who. But he takes it to an extreme. And that line is through the metalwork and in the stonework and everywhere. But more than that, in Guimard's case, he pulls in major ceramic forms and decorates his building with animals and with all kinds of flora and fauna, bats, cats, owls, and so forth. But the big thing for us is that Castel-Barranger is covered in tile.
So I thought we could maybe at this moment pause and just talk a little bit about where tile technology is in this period towards the end of the 19th century. We know that there's sort of several different types of tile being made. Right. One is sort of what we refer to as encaustic.
It is.
And so, I know encaustic as wax painting, but encaustic in the context of tile is a bit different.
Is rather different. Yeah, you're absolutely right. We would say, well, interesting, the history of tile, it's not like the history of pots or the history of figures. It's sort of episodic,
right.
I think.
There's not this continual evolution.
Yeah, it seems to have ongoing golden ages and then gaps. It seems to me that's what the history is. And there's no doubt in my mind, this is a golden age.
Yeah. And so for me, what's part of this encaustic tile, the golden age, these are the Minton tiles, are they not?
Right. So what's happening, Stephanie? Yeah, there is one completely new approach, which is that in 1840, a man called Richard Prosser discovered a new way to make ceramic buttons.
Right.
And he did ceramic buttons by what became known as the pressed dust technique, which you would be far more eloquent at describing than I could.
Well, I mean, it's taking all of the ceramic materials required for a clay body, instead of mixing it with water, taking those powders and compacting them into a tile shape. And so it reduces the need to sort of carefully dry them, and it can be, lend itself into this sort of industrial practice.
Right. So it's almost counterintuitive when we think of clay. We think of clay as being mud, don't we?
Yeah.
There's no mud involved here. Prosser's development was noticed by one of the great ceramic entrepreneurs in England, Herbert Minton.
Yeah.
Now, they were already a ceramic company, Minton's, and quite well known, but Minton realized that those buttons could be made into tiles using pressed dust, and that massively speeds up the tile process. In no time, well, there's a lot of toing and froing, but Minton gets the copyright on pressed dust, and in no time he's got 42 presses knocking out an enormous amount of tile, and there's a tile revolution. So in effect, we have mass-produced tile
Right.
really for the first time. And it's mainly wall tile. The tiles can be pressed and then they can be glazed. And there's effectively a tile revolution in wall tile.
As a way to decorate an interior space.
Absolutely. And the new process is dominated by the British for a few decades, but then it's all over Europe and America as well. That's one thing that happens in tile. The second thing is encaustic tile, which, as you rightly point out, it's not how we normally use that term. Encaustic tile here was invented by medieval monks, so it's not new, but it's effectively creating tiles by building them in relief. So the actual color on the top goes all the way through the tile. You construct the tiles so that, and they became very popular for floor tiles because, of course, as you wear the tile down, it's still the same color.
Right. So there's no glaze on these tiles.
Not glazed. Yeah.
In a mold that's separated by metal sort of, I don't know, they're like little vertical lines. So you have a mold and liquid clay material that's the specific color poured into each of those slots, and then that metal is removed.
That's exactly how
and
it's done.
so, so I'm really familiar with them because they make up the floor of the U.S. Capitol building. But as they wear down, they still exude the pattern. So we have encaustic tile, we have dust pressed tile, and then we have molded or pressed tile into a form to create maybe a more sculptural kind of tile.
Absolutely,
right?
Which it's always referred to as terracotta.
Yeah, or press molding or casting is what we would say sort of as makers.
Absolutely.
So which of these tiles does Guimard use in these buildings that he's creating?
All of them.
All of them?
He makes use of all of them, and but he's especially keen on high relief. So he loves, the tiles become creatures crawling over the building. So it moves into a sculptural form, I would say.
And so I just like to say that these really feel much more, almost closer to bricks than anything else.
Yeah.
These are not these flat tiles that we would put on top of something to cover it. They're integrated into the facades of the building. And so who's making these? Because I have the sense that it's probably not Guimard.
He enjoyed getting his hands dirty, but I think it's fair to say he didn't make the bricks that went into. Absolutely,
right. But he's helping to design them.
Yeah. So if we just very briefly step back, by 1850, 60, all these new processes are available, and they're used widely by architects of the previous movements, like the Gothic revival. You get a lot of sculptural encaustic floors and wall tile. So it comes into big use, and it's this golden age I was describing. And then as we get to the last decade of the 19th century, Art Nouveau explodes, and the architects have got all this ceramic technology to support them. So that's basically, and I would say Guimard is the first one to really exploit it brilliantly.
To really sort of bring all of those things together in a meaningful way.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say better and more than the Belgians, one would say. He really does push it on into a new sphere. And you're absolutely right. He needs people to do it with and to collaborate. I would say with Guimard, and I think all great architects, as we know, they tend to be very shy, humble, quiet people, architects. Is that your experience?
I actually don't know a lot
Like
of architects,
Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright, they're not really. Anyway, let's say that Hector Guimard.
I should say I know a lot of architects, but not personally.
Yes. No, they're lovely. They're all lovely. Guimard was, to say the very least, confident. But what I like about him, he was a team player. And he was an orchestrator, I think, in the sense of understanding the skills. And I think that comes from his decorative arts background.
Yeah.
He got that he didn't know how to do what he wanted for ceramic. And he's very lucky because he bumps into a person who's probably as eccentric as he is in 1894. And this is a man called Alexander Bigot. Alexander Bigot was a chemistry teacher in a high school.
Well, yep.
And I'm sure happy with his life. He goes to the World's Fair in 1889 Bigot, and it's very important that he's a chemist.
It is. Well,
Yeah.
all great ceramicists are chemists.
I've learned this lesson from you frequently. And he's a chemist, and he goes to the World's Fair, and it's the World's Fair that Guimard had been involved in himself, where the Eiffel Tower is brand new, and it also has the Palais de Céramique, and the Palais de Céramique is an enormous building which is, as far as I am aware, and I'm pretty sure it is, held the largest exhibition of ceramics ever,
Interesting.
including up to now. It was a vast hall with ceramic from all over the planet, including older.
Okay.
But every single, anyone who was anyone was there in this giant building. And he walked around the building. Other people who walked around the building and liked it, Paul Gauguin, the great painter, decided to get involved in pottery. So it was a very influential palace. But Bigot goes there, and he thought, I could do this. I know how to do this. And he starts to experiment with ceramic. In the next few years, he starts to make things. He's experimenting with clays and with glazes, and he slowly moves on away from school teaching and starts to present himself as a ceramic sculptor and artist, but deeply aware and committed to the idea of it belonging as part of architecture.
And so he's manufacturing all of the architectural tile that's being used in Castle Béranger.
Right.
Okay.
So 1894, he meets Guimard in a trade fair for ceramic in Paris, and they get to know each other, and Guimard decides he's going to work with Alexander Bigot to do the Castle Béranger. So these extraordinary bats, cats, owls, and flowers, and so those are Bigot, working in tandem with Guimard. We don't know exactly who did what. It's got these extraordinary ceramic creatures dotted around it, and there's 3 different kinds of brick just in the frontal facade, so it's a celebration of brick, as you were suggesting. There's glazed brick. And then as you go down inside the main foyer, there are enormous relief tiles.
That are just built into the wall.
Yeah. And the architectural problem Guimard had was that how to stick them to the wall.
Yeah.
It's easy enough to stick a tile with a bit of putty, but if you've got something that weighs 50 kilos or whatever, and he develops an Art Nouveau framework in metal that holds these giant tiles in place.
Wow. Wow.
And it's one of the great essays in early Art Nouveau, this foyer entrance. Incredibly beautiful, encaustic tile on the floor, and these amazing wall tiles, and outside, these creatures. The other thing I find interesting about the creatures in Guimard, and I think he had a dark side, he loved bats. And cats. And of course, we're in the age, Bram Stoker's Dracula was written 1898, I think, around about there. So we're in an age in which alchemy and darkness and mystery is extremely popular in Europe. And the Gothic revival, Goths. So it's as though Guimard wants to develop modern gargoyles and modern creatures.
Well, I mean, and in some ways, I would say that those are reminiscent, the way that the animals are perched, sort of emerging from those ceramic tiles, right? And so Bigot and Guimard, they work together. Do they continue this relationship in further buildings? What happens to Bigot?
Bigot's career really takes off, and he remains at the center of Art Nouveau. He doesn't work with Guimard much again, but he ends up working with a large number of the great Art Nouveau architects like Henri van der Velde, Louis Majorelle, Jules Lavirotte. So he works with a range of people, providing for them what he provided Guimard with, which is architectural ceramic and tile. He forms his own company in 1897, Bigot and Son, and continues on successfully then, dying finally in 1927 in the Art Deco years. So a long, successful career. One of my favorite buildings, which is maybe an extreme of Art Nouveau ceramic, is by Jules Lavirot, and it's number 29 Avenue Rap in Paris. And very famously is completely encrusted with people and animals in the Art Nouveau style. So probably Biget's most extreme project. So at one level, we might say that Guimard invented Biget.
Well, he didn't invent him. He launched his career.
I was just going to take that back. I was just going to take that back. But I think that he gave Biget the opportunity. But I would say also as the architect in the practice, I think he did help Biget understand how his art could fit into architecture.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by invented, in the sense that Biget's a deeply skilled character. So he had a factory just outside Paris at a small town called Mer, and continued to make this material for the next couple of decades. So a great success story there.
He's finished his first Art Nouveau building in Paris, which is also the first major Art Nouveau building in France.
It is.
Right? And I would imagine he's riding a pretty big high at this point.
He absolutely is. And it's not long after that building that we get references to Art Nouveau being called Le Style Guimard.
Oh, interesting.
And I'm sure Guimard enjoyed that immensely. So the style is quite closely associated with him, that's for sure.
And as a result of this building.
Largely as a result of Castel Barranger. He continues to design and to build. There's a very powerful building, which is another wonderful essay in ceramic, but not in Paris, in Lille. And it's known as the Maison Quaillot. And it was commissioned by Louis Quaillot, who fascinatingly described himself as a ceramic entrepreneur. So a businessman who'd moved into the architectural ceramic world. So again, we can remind ourselves this is a bit of a golden age for ceramic in architecture, where a ceramic entrepreneur seemed a logical thing to be.
Right. Good. We're going to make a decision to pursue that as a career path. There must have been a desire for it, a market for it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So Quaillot asks Guimard to build him it's partly house and it's partly a shop, and it feels that way, in Lille. And Guimard does that. Now, Quaillot has developed a new ceramic glaze and body, which I'm very curious what you think of it, Stephanie. He calls it lava, his lava glaze, and kind of gives a sense that it comes from a volcano somehow. And it's a very deep, textured, rich kind of green glaze, which, having rubbed and hugged and kissed this building frequently over the years, it is quite puzzling. The material itself feels quite puzzling, this deep green. But Guimard builds the whole facade in that. It's quite a Gothic-y version of Art Nouveau. It's very pointy and full of Guimard's characteristic typography. Which is developing also. So we're here at the end of the 19th century, an architect really, absolutely on the front foot, and clearly chosen by this businessman, Quaillot. He wants Guimard to do this for him.
Specifically.
Because it's going to make noise if Guimard does it.
Right. And so I would imagine that the ceramics that are used in the facade of this, they're also an advertisement for Quaillot, right? He's using this as a way to present his business out to the world. It's interesting that glaze or that surface is called lava. There's a long history of using chemistry, the chemistry of glazes to create a lava-like glaze. Those glazes are not usually very stable and sturdy, and so my inclination is that more of that texture is coming through the texturing of the clay underneath, with a glaze on top of it to give us that structure. But again, I haven't been up close and personal with this building as you have, but it's an interesting and possibly one of the earlier mentions of that type of a surface in glaze. And it does look, if you think about the way that when lava certain types of lava cool and create sort of pumice, it's this sort of surface or texture. Yeah,
It's clearly
yeah.
what he's after.
So,
Yeah.
so I want to interrogate just for a minute. Was the rest of society in love with Art Nouveau in a way that, I mean, I'm in love with Art Nouveau. I've always thought it was such an incredible, energetic style. Again, all these like curving lines, introduction of organics in a way where historic architecture is, is post and lintel. It's blocks of building, and so we're really having a transformation of the building, not just on the outside, but on the inside. It's almost as if these buildings are vessels, right?
Yeah.
And the ceramic comes from the outside to the inside. Was this well received?
There's no doubt in my mind it's a component of Art
Yeah.
Nouveau. It's got that feel to it. And of course, there are an awful lot of vessels in
Right,
the Art Nouveau
right.
style, which is another story altogether. It was controversial, I would
Mm.
say. There are clearly people who love it. And it starts to get, it's always a test in architecture. If you start to get major commissions, if you build houses for a private individual, okay. But if you get to build a theatre or a bank or a major office block, it's a sign that the style is thought to be acceptable symbolically. There's not a huge amount of that in Art Nouveau in France. It's mainly private commissions through the last decade of the 19th century until something quite dramatic happens that we'll come to. I would say controversial. Some people loved it and were prepared to fight for it. Some people utterly loathed it and felt that it was a decadent, negative, and a range of people prepared to go along with it. So perhaps that would be typical mix for avant-garde or new architecture, I would say. So in its initial iteration, it was stable enough, I would say. It's going to lose popularity dramatically, but at this stage, still thought to be acceptable. There are interesting footnotes to that. The Americans weren't keen, that's for sure.
No, I don't think we have a lot of Art Nouveau buildings
There's not a lot of
across
it.
the
Yeah,
United
there's not a
States.
lot. I would
Certainly.
say the closest we get is probably Chicago
Well, okay.
and Louis Sullivan and so forth. Early Frank Lloyd Wright. It's quite, we would say, secession-y. It's quite of that
Yeah.
period. But there's not a lot,
Yeah.
no. But the people who hated it most, to the point of which they tried to make it illegal, the English.
The English
The Scots, on the other hand,
embraced it.
embrace it. And Glasgow is one of the great centres of late 19th century Art Nouveau. The English don't like it. You don't find it. You get hints of it in London, but the English go against it. Now, there are all kinds of interesting reasons. Psychologically, I would say one of the elements of Art Nouveau is that it's sensuous, tipping into being sensual, tipping into being naughty. Now, the English were the first ones to do it with Aubrey Beardsley. Aubrey Beardsley's work can be very naughty.
Well, but wasn't the illustrations and the Oscar Wilde play Salome, wasn't it banned because the images were perceived to be too salacious?
It was thought to be pornographic.
Exactly.
His illustrations for Lysistrata, well, yes, soft porn, I would say, Salome. Lysistrata, a further one, quite hard porn.
A turn we've taken on the ceramic podcast. I want to refocus us though back to Paris for a minute.
Right.
Those things aside.
So we have a style that's accepted. It's changing things. It's controversial, but still on the whole positive.
But it does start to take off, and it starts to take off with something we talked about sort of at the top. Is that he is probably most famous for his famous designs of Art Nouveau metro stations.
Yeah.
And so before we kind of dig into that, let's just maybe a little context around the history of subways or undergrounds, as you call them here. But London was the first underground system in the world.
Yeah, London was first, and it's a story really from the 1860s onwards. So it starts as steam and then eventually electrifies at the end of the century. But London set the pace, and it was determined in Paris that Paris needed to develop its own underground system known as the metro system eventually. And it happens there and is launched for Paris 1900, the Great World's Fair. So the first metro stations that the Parisians have open with this World's Fair. So what happens is quite late on, in fact, the organization must have been very tight because it's 1899, so not a lot of time in advance. They want designs for the entranceways and the main kind of vestibules. So the lines themselves have been dug, and they're all going to launch in 1900. And they put out a call for entries to the architectural profession and to see what comes in. Now, what comes in, it's interesting. The president of the Compagnie de Chemin de Fer Métropolitain de Paris,
That's a mouthful.
Paris Metro, Adrien Bénard, doesn't like what comes in, especially, and he thinks it's a bit boring. It's also got to be something quite dramatic because, it's the Paris World's Fair.
And it's a brand new way of transport and a way to move people through the city.
Absolutely it is. So in the way that quite often you get very dramatic architecture at airports, in the late 19th century, train stations and here a metro station, they wanted something, some drama, something modern.
Something that you wouldn't miss.
Yeah, something that symbolized modernity, and he didn't see it. But he was a patron of the arts, Bénard, and his wife especially so. So they were aware of the Parisian avant-garde, and they were aware of how strong it was. So Guimard was also in that circle.
Okay.
And he invited Guimard to present.
Oh, interesting.
To send something in. And he developed these designs in the high Art Nouveau style. And they remain, one of the great symbols of Paris, don't they?
They do.
They're everywhere, and they've been constantly talked about ever since. They have a very controversial history, through the 20th century, which we might come back to at the end. They didn't remain universally popular, that's for sure.
And so should we, again, we'll take a minute to perhaps describe what they look like. The metro stations are built out of cast iron, but when you look at them, they look like they are maybe aged bronze.
Yeah.
Right. So we could think bronze is sort of that yellowy kind of color. And if you let it tarnish, it develops this sort of greenish tinge to it. And so within metalworking, you can take iron and you can make it look like an aged bronze, and we would call that a patina.
Yeah.
And so there's lots of different kinds of patinas and treatments of the surface of the metal to yield different color or surface responses. And so, it's a material that's mimicking something else.
Absolutely, yeah. So that iron playing at being bronze.
Yeah.
And of course, bronze is more expensive.
It is.
And more luxurious. So that was part of the game that was going on. Yeah.
We have this sort of the whiplash curvilinear style. They're arching over the entrance to the metro station. There's sort of a short fence at the base that goes around, and they've got this big sort of yellow sign in the middle that says metro entrance or Metropolitan. That's right. And then there are these sort of floral like lamps on either side.
Yeah.
And so they're really quite remarkable and striking. And I mean, I kind of find them magical, especially the ones that are still in and around Paris. Those are probably replicas, not the original anymore.
One thing I find interesting about them is, and it was said by Guimard and a number of the other Art Nouveau architects, is that they were interested in nature and in plants and flowers, but not so much the flower head.
Yeah.
Much more the stems and sepals.
The vines.
Yeah, and seeds. So there's an organic feel to them.
There are.
And it was remarked at the time, perhaps they have a slightly sexual element to them. That was commented on, that there's a kind of metamorphosis, that there's a hint of body forms in them, which was perhaps why they were thought to be quite controversial, and for many, of course, it frightened the English to death, obviously. But that sense of sensuality is part of Art Nouveau,
It is.
and it counted against it as the years went on into the 20th century. They're incredible designs. Originally, there were a number of different formats. A lot of the original stations had canopies, glass canopies, and one or two still have their canopies. The oldest and most preserved one is probably Abbesse in Montmartre, and there are several others around.
Yep.
Originally also almost a complete little building as you went in. None of those survive. And your bog standard one would have been these huge arms, as you know, with lamps and then the
And the
sign in the
sign.
middle. There's not a lot of ceramic on the outside. I might add the metal is used in a very organic
It
way
is.
that kind of feels part of the aesthetic of the ceramic world in some sense. I'm sure you'd agree with that. But they developed this in white industrial tile with beveled edges, which decorates most of these early metro stations.
So when you go underground, we're talking about the tile that is on the walls, that's on the
Absolutely.
floor, and so this sort of ubiquitous today, what we refer to as subway tile.
You bet.
And you're saying that it's come from this design from Guimard.
That particular bevel design, yeah, that's from these stations, and there it is. And if you think about it as well, you're asking people to go below ground.
Which is dark.
Yeah.
And so it's lined with a white tile.
So it's hygienic, it's light, and so forth. And quite often the station names are in a sort of dark cobalt blue background tile with white lettering. So that comes from this
So
period.
he designs, contemporarily you might think of just the iron arches that go over it, but he actually designed the entire station, everything that went into the station itself, including all of the tile.
Yeah, he physically created the maquettes for the entire entranceway, and then he became an advisor to the president and to his team about the tile and so forth. So he took part in the design as well. So yes, it's Guimard, absolutely Guimard.
And so what's also, I think exciting at this moment in time is that this new system has opened up across Paris. It's connecting people. It's a way that anyone or every man can travel, and so this is perhaps sort of there's some politics involved here around access.
Guimard was a political figure, I would say, and it's interesting how he acquired that. But he clearly perceived of his architecture as art, and he clearly perceived it as a public art form. And he had quite a powerful democracy written into him. He liked the idea of mass-produced design and design that could go wider. So yes, I would think that 100% he thought he was bringing art to the Parisian public with his metro stations and with his wider practices as well. It's interesting that even from a young age, and it sounds extreme now, but was less so then, his nickname was the Ravachol of architecture. And Ravachol at that time was the nickname of a very famous extreme anarchist who was fond of bombing and, effectively a terrorist.
Great.
Ravachol. And he was known as the Ravachol of architecture.
Because he blew up the traditional landscape.
Yeah. I think that they weren't hinting that he was going to blow anything up.
No, but it was an explosion of something new, of new ideas. And of course, that's always makes the old guard uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And anarchist as well. So anarchism at that stage was a serious political position. And anarchism was element. It transmutates into a broader socialism, of course. But we will broadly say that Guimard was, I would say, socialist rather than anarchist, but very much idealist. Now, where did he get that from? Well, I think he got it from his own head. That's what he thought. But he spent time in London amongst the arts and crafts people. William Morris's writings were all translated into French, and so he was aware of that you can use architecture and design for the public good.
And so this opportunity to design the metro stations is absolutely in line with his creative practice, but also his political views of providing access for everyone. Right?
Absolutely.
Not only in transportation, but in good design, and so today these stations are emblematic, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we chatted a little bit about the response to this style, and it's somewhat mixed. But are the metro stations received positively?
Uh, Controversial, I would say again. Now, it's an interesting one that in 1889 there was a big fight to stop the Eiffel Tower being built. And then after it went up, there was a big fight to keep it up there.
Right. Because it was meant to be temporary.
The thought was, in actual fact, I think Eiffel had no idea how to take it down once it had gone up. But that's another story. And of course, it's now the symbol of the city. I think the metro station is very similar.
I think so too.
And it's like a marker for that age. But at the time, they were controversial. And I would say a lot of people thought they were going to disappear once the expo was over, but they didn't disappear.
They didn't. So we see this, this style that takes off, that it's, perhaps sort of egalitarian in intentions, but it's not long lived. It has kind of a quick decline, and by 1910, Art Nouveau has really made way for Art Deco. What's that transition like?
Yeah, it's I've been overly obsessed with the history of style for too many decades, I would say, Stephanie. And as you know, the Gothic seems to go for 400 years, and then each successive style,
and they sort of overlap each other, and then get
they
whisked
get
away.
shorter and shorter and shorter. So I would say Art Nouveau effectively has 17, 18 years. Of course, if we thought a style in fashion now would last 17 years, that would be a miracle.
Yeah.
But it was noted at the time that this is not a major style, it's just a fad. And that word was used. It was used in the American press a lot. It's just a fad. Now, why did Art Nouveau collapse? Well, we've just described it as something which could be perceived as being very left-wing.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, and I think even Guimard was unsure about this, is that it's obviously international. It's obviously about looking around Europe and looking, over to the Americas. Obviously so. It's obviously influenced by Japan, very powerfully so. So it's an international style, arguably the first self-consciously international style. And they're using nature to do that. As we get towards the First World War, and as Europe starts to get more paranoid, the French have already been invaded and conquered by the Prussians. Germany's united, and national identity and nationalism is getting stronger and stronger and stronger through the years. Likewise in Britain, the British are getting more nationalist in their outlook.
It declines, and what happens to Guimard? Right.
So what happens is Art Nouveau suddenly is seen as an unacceptable style politically. Yeah. So it starts to fade away. Through those years, Guimard, interestingly, tries to suggest endlessly that Art Nouveau is a French national style. He tries to keep selling it that way. I've got a little quote here, which I found very interesting, just a quickie. But this is Guimard trying to keep it alive, I think. He says, the principles of the Middle Ages and those of the 19th century added to my doctrine, so he thought Art Nouveau was him, added to my doctrine, should supply us with a foundation for a French Renaissance and an entirely new style. Let the Belgians, the Germans, and the English evolve for themselves a national art, and assuredly, in so doing, they'll perform a true and sound and useful work for their countries. In other words, Art Nouveau is ours, it's French, and it's modern. Now, nobody really believed that by 1910. And the style goes out of fashion heavily. And as you hint, we think of Art Deco as being 1920s, but in actual fact, it's kind of already around by 1910. Yep. And Art Nouveau becomes hated, and many right-wing critics and conservative critics really go for it. And it's wiped off the agenda.
What happens to Guimard's architectural practice alongside the sort of decline in Art Nouveau and the rise of Art Deco?
Well, he continues to build, And the Castle Barranger, as we said, is in the 16th arrondissement. A number of other buildings go up. He builds his own house there as well, and apartment blocks on Avenue de Mozart and so forth.
Uh-huh.
So he continues to build. But what we notice is that the buildings get simpler and simpler and far less typical of what we would think of as Art Nouveau. He builds a synagogue in the center of Paris, which is finished, I think, 1912-13, and really stripped back and simplified out. So his own approach to Art Nouveau begins to fade and begins to change for a far simpler, purer approach. And the style itself, as we're suggesting, has lost its position by 1910, 11, 12. Yeah.
Okay. But his style still defines Paris, especially in this area of the 16th arrondissement. And we can attribute this Art Nouveau architecture and the use of ceramic tiles to kind of define an era of his work. And so what happens to Guimard in the end?
Well, I think it's a long, slow fade. I would say it would be a mistake to say that he remained a major figure in French architecture or architecture elsewhere. And I guess we define him by late 19th, early 20th century, I would say. But he continues on. I would say perhaps a little embittered, certainly a lower profile, but recognized as one of the major figures at the beginnings of French modernism. He carries on practicing. He's got an interesting relationship with the States, with America. His work is known there. And in 1938, he and his wife decide to leave France, and they emigrate to the States. And finally, he dies in 1942 in New York.
What an amazing contribution to the history of architecture, the decorative arts. The language that he built is still well known today, even if many of these buildings and, sadly, metro stations no longer exist.
Yes, a career of a fantastic achievement, and the metro station, it remains a great symbol of Paris. But ironically, of course, that as we go through the decades in the 20th century, we get to the 60s, the majority of them have been ripped out of the ground. There are very few left around, a handful. The others have disappeared. Once again, as we go around Paris, they're absolutely everywhere. And of course, what those are replicas.
So those are the ones that are there today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So a few originals still. Abbess is original, and there are others, but in actual fact, the vast majority of the others have been recast and repositioned.
Well,
so there are more metro stations now than when Guimard was around, which is a good thing, I would say. But they're
so.
replicas. They're replicas.
I do think that they're kind of magical things to come across when you're walking down the street looking for a metro station.
A wonderful legacy.
Yes.
And, a man who had 20 fantastic years of design. And we can enjoy him as well because, as we were saying, he was quite radical in the way he presented and sold himself. He was a major designer as well as architect.
And we also might not think of him as a user of ceramic tile, right? We can think about those buildings. I certainly think about, again, sort of the use of metal, of stone. But in actual fact, the history of tile is really wrapped up in his architectural design.
I would say he's a major figure. And in a golden age where there were wonderful things happening, he was one of the great figures. And he also produced a range of ceramic wares, jardinières and water fountains and so forth. And those are still available, and we can enjoy them. So a major contributor to the world of architectural ceramic and tile, Hector Guimard.
So that's it for us today. Until next time, thanks for listening. To find out more and to see the images of the works of art we've been talking about in this episode and all of our episodes, go to HENI.com/the history of ceramics. And if you want to read more about the wondrous nature of Art Nouveau architecture, look for Paul's book at HENI.com/shop. or see him in the Art Nouveau films at heni.com/talks.
Goodbye.